Welcome to the Illusions of Reality with your hosts, Burt Baxter and Kincade.
Welcome, friends, to the Illusions of Reality, your one-stop shop for conspiracy theory, current events, politics, and the discussion of reality. I'm your host, Kincade. With me, as always, is Burt Baxter. Today, we're actually bringing you a special guest with us. One of the silent, behind-the-scenes members of the Illusions of Reality team, our good friend Jay, is going to be joining us. And today, we're going to be talking about false flag terrorism and the makeup of what it takes behind the scenes to pull the strings to get people to, I guess, delve into warfare, so to speak. So, Jay, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I think I started to realize as I researched more and more into history, American history especially, and the conspiracy side. I started to notice a trend that wars seem to always start with very dubious, kind of strange and controversial events. And I started to realize that I started to go down the list in order, starting with 9/11, and worked my way back. And research, every time I looked, there was always something strange at the beginning. And I kind of started to realize that I think I started asking myself why. Why did people always seem to require these events? Why couldn't they start wars naturally, just with propaganda and stuff like this?
You know, in American history especially, it always seems to follow that same narrative of a neutrality, no involvement on our side, then something seems to happen,
Right.
hence the false flag, so...
Well, for the audience members out there who might not know, Jay, if you wouldn't mind giving them just a little synopsis of what is a false flag.
So a false flag is an event that is staged where one party secretly hatches a plan that makes it look like it's been attacked in some way, and then they are able to then gain the authority and the approval of the people to respond with war.
And simultaneously riling up the population, injecting that us against them kind of mentality.
Right. So they always seem to need something extra. They need, usually what amounts to is deaths. They need deaths, and usually they need young deaths. A lot of times it's military or civilian deaths, women and children, that have the most emotional effect. And so by doing this, they're then given the approval of the people to go invade, attack, whatever it is that gains them their advantage. So essentially, that's what a false flag attack is, and what it's for.
So it's the old adage of problem, reaction, solution.
Right.
So basically, they're creating a problem to get a reaction out of society to bring about a solution that they already had organized and orchestrated from the get-go.
Right.
So I mean, the best modern example that the audience probably is aware of would be 9/11.
Right. Everyone knows 9/11. Even teenagers nowadays know about 9/11 conspiracies, or at least most of them do. I don't know if that's really something that we need to go too in depth into.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the audience is already familiar with the whole.
Some of our prior episodes have kind of discussed some of the, documentaries or
right.
things that you would want to check into. But yeah, as far as the general conspiracy idea, you're pretty aware.
So Jay, with this being your area of expertise, take us on a little false flag trek here, if you will. Where are we going throughout the past to where we've seen the powers that be's fingerprints all over the warfare of mankind, so to speak?
Well, as you said, America is always at war. It's been at war almost every year that it's existed. It's been in dozens and dozens of wars, and it's only declared war 5 times the entire time. I've passed almost 250 years with over 20, 30 major and medium and like sized wars and skirmishes. But it's always at war. Empires always run off war and cheap labor is really the only 2 things you need to keep an empire going, and have always been required. And so we've always been at war. And so what I did was I started at the end with 9/11, like most people, and then I started working my way back. I just started researching, and I just started going down the list of every major war that America's been in. And I just saw over and over and over again that there was bizarre, controversial, irregular, questionable instances. And
Same pattern.
same pattern. There's a pattern of there's always an event that had to happen, and then after that, the people are won over, and it was the powder keg event, as they always call it. So after 9/11. Previous major war before that is the Gulf War.
Right.
And
So you're saying the Gulf War now had the same fingerprints on it as well? There was false flags to incite the Gulf War?
right. The people in America, Democrats especially, and a lot of Republicans had no desire to go to war in the Middle East. When that happened, America had never had a major war. Only little terrorist events and things like that, like in Beirut and Lebanon and stuff like that, but never a major war in the Middle East, really. So when it happened, no one really wanted to have anything to do with it. It was between Iraq and Kuwait, and we didn't really see how it affected us, or at least why we should risk American lives for it. So they had to have an event. They had to have something, a final last straw that would occur, and everyone would know, and it would be taboo not to agree with war at that point. You'd be thought of as unpatriotic and crazy.
So what was that event with the Gulf War now? Because I'm unfamiliar with what.
If you remember, I know at the time I was probably around 12, and I can remember some of the Kuwaiti oil fields and some of the real, just the genesis of even us being involved over there. And I remember, even as a young person, thinking it was under the guise of protection of the Kuwaiti people. I remember that being some sort of issue in its infancy that was brought up.
Right. They used to show constantly. They would show the pictures of the oil fields on fire. Just great propaganda footage, great video. It's very emotional, folks' emotional response. And then the major event that won over everybody to intervene was when a young nurse that only went by her first name, she didn't give a last name, she appeared before Congress, and she testified and claimed that she was in Kuwait working in hospitals when the Iraqi army arrived, and claimed that the Iraqi army soldiers ransacked the hospitals, took babies out of incubators, and threw them onto the floor to die. At the time when this happened,
I do vaguely remember that story.
right? If you were an adult in the 90s when this occurred, this was common knowledge on the nightly news. It was pumped out. Everybody had heard this, whether you remember it now or not. But if you were alive back then, there's a pretty good chance that you heard this story. And once Congress heard that and the American people watched it, it was pretty much a done deal after that. And what it turns out is that the girl that testified in front of Congress just so happens to be the daughter of Kuwait, their ambassador to America. So they then discovered that she was coached and the event was staged. She was taught by the best people in the business, because the people that taught her were the people that Kuwait had hired to represent their case to the American people. Essentially, they hired a American PR firm, the probably most powerful one in the whole world, called Hill Knowlton Strategies. They represent half of all Fortune 500 companies. They represent human rights violation countries like Indonesia, Turkey, the Maldives, and Uganda. This company is one of the number one firms engaged by fracking interests in recent years. So they're essentially in charge of selling fracking to the American people. That's who they chose. They chose this firm. And this firm is the firm that taught this girl how to go in front of the cameras and win over the American people.
And when you think about that in the context of that war in general, and a lot of people thinking that when you throw, it's funny that the fracking interests come up because what was generally believed to be that whole war in a nutshell. Us going over there to take the oil,
right?
For lack of a better term.
And on the flip side, the reason that they've sold to the American people that Iraq was attacking Kuwait, other than just being bloodthirsty savages like they always represent their enemies, but they said that it was completely greed-based. Iraq wanted to get Kuwait's oil and wanted its territory. And no one really knows much more other than that, for the most part. But there's a lot of things that are happening behind the scenes that people don't really hear about or know about. Of course, now it's come to light that everybody pretty much knows now that America was kind of in bed with Iraq and Iran at the same time when they're fighting each other in a war that lasts years and caused hundreds of thousands of deaths as America sells arms to both sides, sells chemical weapons of mass destructions to Iraq, the ones that...
The very same thing that we have accused them, and ironically was used as reasoning here, again, to tie into, it all ties back in. You can bring 9/11 back into it. Another funny little relationship there is look at what administration was in charge, in both ones. So,
both ties back to the Bush family.
Yeah.
It's almost like you can see them kicking around. It's like, well, how are we going to sell the American people on getting them into war again?
Yeah.
Well, what about those weapons we sold them?
Tried and true methods, something that they've, it was, I remember always hearing, crazy things such as, well, even during 9/11 times, is this revenge for Bush's dad? Just... Mm-hmm. Crazy mythical theories here and there
I remember
abound.
hearing that as well, yeah.
But like you said, if you look into it, it's, again, probably more to do with the money and the economic control over that area, which is probably still what's going on today.
I just find it very interesting to find out that there's like a think tank behind her whole coaching and what I mean? There's fingerprints all over the whole thing to where it's not just, as they would sell the story to the media, just a random, victim or innocent bystander. And it's like, she has relative ties to someone in the government. Big surprise.
Which today, in the age of technology, you would think, man, wouldn't that be such a red flag or such? But, back then, prior to the internet and things like that, those are things that, as obvious as they were, probably were never exposed until...
And she only went by her first name, so... there was really no way to, even if you had the internet, you probably wouldn't be able to know who she was until someone eventually leaked it out like they did.
Well, the propaganda, I remember, at the time of the Gulf War was just, it was just, there was no internet back then, as Burt just touched on. So, there's no way to delve in and get info, but it was full blown. I know, at that age, everybody I knew was pro this war.
Right.
You know what I mean? We even had, do you remember the Desert Storm trading cards?
Yeah.
Like Norman Schwarzkopf.
Yeah, everyone wanted Norman.
Yeah, trading cards.
Storm and Norman.
Yeah, kids. Yeah. We're collecting baseball, football, Garbage Pail Kids, comic cards, this, that. And then we're also collecting Desert Storm cards.
They take larger-than-life characters, generals, and they sell them to the people as characters. They take them and these companies like... Hill Knowlton Strategies, they take them and they coach them and they find people that they think will be more marketable, and because they know America's like these big personalities, like they would.
Think of Schwarzkopf. He totally fit the bill.
Yeah, and so that's the Gulf War, and then if as you go down the line of major wars, you go down before that, you have the Vietnam War. Started in the late 60s. And that's a little bit more in the past, but still semi-recent. So still people might know a little bit more than they would previous stuff, what led up to it. So Vietnam, we have Gulf of Tonkin, which we have I don't know if you guys have hit on that on this show yet.
We haven't, I don't think, but other than 9/11, probably the most, as far as just a sheer definition of a false flag event, in the context of history, this is probably the one that most people can look at and go to and say, man, what an obvious.
And since especially it's been they've done research and investigations, and the official investigation has said that it was a non-event, and so we now know for sure, or almost for certain, have admitted publicly that the events didn't happen. And so if you don't know, Gulf of Tonkin is basically the event that leads to the exact same situation in the previous war. And what you'll find out is in every war, a country population has no desire to go to war, and they are won over by a emotional event or something that is so egregious that they feel like they no longer have choice to be non-interventionist. And so for Vietnam, it's the Gulf of Tonkin. And so a American naval vessel is off the coast of Vietnam, and they had small boats from the Vietnamese, North Vietnamese small boats were circling and kind of threatening the American ship because they're right off their coast. So America jumps in the situation and claims that they've had a torpedo fired at them by one of the fast boats, claiming that they saw it on their radar. And this becomes news, and this is the event that they needed to push everyone over the edge and get everyone agreement that war is the solution. So this happens, and then everyone lives their lives thinking that we entered a war being struck first, which is always the requirement.
Well, to go back to what we were saying in the opening of the show here, which is the underlying truth is none of us deep down want to go to war. Nobody wants war and conflict and casualty and death. You have to, normal people that is. Psychopaths like those in government and leadership positions, of course, it's a different story. They're thinking of ways to poke and prime and to get, your normal moral-minded folks behind these heinous causes and behind heinous murders and attacks
Right, because the people have nothing to gain from the wars. They're
not the people fighting.
Not the people fighting.
Right.
All they can hope for is that they don't die. That's all they're going to return with is their lives, hopefully, and they'll go back to their life. And that's all they had to gain from it.
To think of the benefits, because it's always normally under the guise of I'm protecting my family in a figurative and a literal sense, as far as. But look at some of the advantages. Some of these military, and this is, something that could probably delve off into a totally different subject. But yeah, I think generally human instinct, human nature doesn't want to stand across from a side of another person who's either shooting or trying to stab them. That's just instinct to survival.
Well, I know the little bit of research I did into the Vietnam War, the thing that I found the most interesting is that the main battle line where this war was fought never moved. The entire time. It was as if there was no
progress,
progress or
stalemate.
Objective or any, you know what I mean? It was almost like an economy boost to.
Read a ton about things like that, to where the strategic generals, the people behind it, were instructed to basically stalemate the whole thing. And even though, like you said, it's a little older, but you're maybe a generation removed. A lot of people have, I'm 35. A lot of people have uncles or family members who have fought, and can just attribute to the sheer, brutality, and kind of allude to that thing. Nobody really knows what they were ever doing. seemed just really like a pointless endeavor,
Right.
and killed a ton of young men from that generation.
Yeah, they're fighting a limited war, and you find out that you really can't win limited wars, especially because we're in a country where the people, they're going to still be there after the war is over. So they're in it for the long haul no matter what. So if you're not, they're going to essentially just wait for you to leave. Because if you're fighting a limited war, you're not going to stay there and invade and make that now your territory. Once you're gone, they're going to reclaim what they lost.
Right.
So we have the Gulf of Tonkin. Then if you go before that, the next event that has these kind of symptoms at the start is World War II. And
World War II.
World War II, where everyone knows about Pearl Harbor, and it's even a little bit still, probably not younger kids like teenagers, but people in their 20s probably have heard by this time about some of the suspicious things that happened during World War II. Pearl Harbor, over 1,000 Japanese messages are intercepted every day in the weeks leading up to Pearl Harbor. So America had cracked Japan's codes and knew virtually everything that they knew, and still left the entire port undefended virtually.
I believe a literal translation at some point was down to, GPS-wise, a surprise aggressive move in Pearl Harbor, basically. I mean, they knew exactly. They've intercepted missions. I know Navajo Indians were recruited. The
Right.
whole backstory to that is that we obviously knew what was going to happen.
Yeah.
I just always, I can't say always, when I had the mind to fathom these kind of things, found it totally unbelievable to think that the entire Japanese fleet could be off the coast of the United States and they would have no idea.
Right.
It's not like it was a time of peace. There was a world war going on at the time.
Right.
So to think that they were caught off guard,
Yeah.
but to kind of collaborate what you're saying, the essence of the false flag was, we, the collective we, America, I should say, was unscathed at this point. They weren't involved in the war.
And it was a very pointed effort not to be.
In an economical slump,
Yeah.
tough times the country was facing, they weren't involved. And at the time, if you go back and you even, look at the census of the public perception of what was going on in World War II at the time in America, not even everyone was opposed to what was going on over there as far as Hitler and the Nazi regime and whatnot, because they didn't really have the full grasp and understanding of what was happening.
Right.
So how do you take a group of people where, times are kind of tough, but hey, no one's getting killed and dying, and get them to load up, pack up, go overseas and start killing strangers? You need that, drama, that moral, tie to that emotional bond to,
Right.
there's been an attack.
You need to strike on the homeland.
Right.
Absolutely. To get that sort of involvement. So the story goes, whatever percentage of the country was vehemently opposed to joining that war.
Right.
And then it immediately after you have Pearl Harbor, whatever percentages of people rushed to go sign up, to go fight.
Right. And Germany was actually really popular in America. It was popular in a lot of places during the war. People didn't know about really much of the what would later be called atrocities and widespread deaths and things like this. So they a lot of people were on board with both teams, and so the country was pretty split and didn't feel like it was in their interest to enter the war. At this time, we were still not really making allies. We were just making trading partners, and that's what they originally did before. We didn't. The theme was always don't get involved.
Well, speaking of trading partners, it's interesting if you go back and actually delve into the meat and potatoes of World War II and come to find out how many big American business interests were profiting hand over fist from World War II, to where, the Bush family, we can delve in, that would just be a whole other segue into a whole other area up there, but the American Ford, You know?
Everybody knows the IG farming, the ties, the things like that. But like you said, many more interested, more involved.
So you had these big American business interests making fortunes off of what was going on over there in World War II from concentration slave camp labor. Ford supposedly had a picture of Hitler near his desk or something. I remember hearing or stumbling across at one point. But he was supplying tanks. They ended up doubling their profits because, I mean, if people think, well, why would they want to go to war? Well, you know, the military-industrial complex is making a fortune off these wars. They're already making money off the European front and what was going on in that side of the world. And then, boom, you stage a reason for America to enter the war. Now you're making tanks for both sides.
Yeah. You're putting the whole country to work.
And Ford would go on after his Ford factories in Germany were bombed. He would go on to sue the United States government for bombing his buildings over in a foreign country.
He won, if I'm not mistaken. He actually sued the United States government, and then they all walked away scot-free from the Nuremberg trials without even, I mean, I think the supposed cover story dilemma there that I stumbled across, years ago researching, is that they did not want to basically persecute and charge all these big heads of industry because the American economy was already in such a tattered state.
Plus the exposure of their involvement.
Right.
But then when you delve further into that and you look at things such as Operation Paperclip, those were totally, something for the public to see, to try to have some sort of, demonization of these people, when in reality they were brought over here and put in other heads of industry.
Yep.
Well, when you go
the
into
rocket program, Paperclip. Operation Paperclip's another great thing to try to research.
I was just about to touch on with Paperclip there. If you delve into Operation Paperclip or Project Paperclip and look at what they did, they took all the pretty much minds of value,
leading
scientists and researchers and propagandists, and they brought them over and gave them new aliases and identities through the United States government. So it almost begs you to ask the question, who really won the war? Did they not just displace and absorb into American society and culture? Did they?
You're looking at a country or just that blueprint of Nazi Germany, the Third Reich, and like you said, what more? Was it defeated, or was it brought into our absolved into what we have over here? Extension of even modern day times.
Right. It's almost as if they wisened up and went covert, because from there, I believe, after Project Paperclip, it was the founding of the CIA.
Yeah, they pretty much found NASA as well, and the MK Ultra and all the psychological research is carried out by them. A lot of the weapons of mass destruction field is carried out by Nazi doctors in America. After that, they have the island, Plum Island, that everyone's seen. So all these guys are coming over and taking over or working alongside all the American experts in the fields and combining with them. Then, yeah.
Well, the art of propaganda most certainly took off in America after that. I mean, that's where, just the subliminals and just, they basically took everything that the Nazis had already done and were successful with, brought it over, streamlined it. And they, like you were just touching on, the MK Ultra project, subliminals and propaganda, and then the manipulation and use of television.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That totally coincides around that same time frame. And if you think, barring Vietnam, the next big, like you touched on earlier, Jay, as far as maybe an unforeseen, not physical war, but the Cold War and some of the techniques used there, just to demonize an entire,
generation.
Russian, yeah, absolutely. Russia was looked at. I can remember growing up as a kid and being, the Red Scare. Kind of thing.
Every bad guy in every movie, every bad guy in every video game, a bad guy in every comic.
Saturated itself in every,
Constantly.
and that's propaganda at its finest.
Well, I've always, I mean, that goes back to how we were just touching on how there's Gulf War playing cards for kids. Like, Jay, you bring up a good point. Notice how the enemies change in the pop culture, in the movies that you're watching, whatever's going on in the political scene in the country at the time. Back in the 80s, if you will remember.
Ivan Drago.
Right. Rocky.
Yeah.
Every enemy in every movie in the 80s was Russian.
Yeah.
Fast forward, to the 90s, it was, everybody was Middle Eastern. And then,
Yeah.
I mean, you see the same when we had the little I don't know why I still, that's deep conditioning right there where you say we still, like you're tied to a country as if it's a collective, like I'm a part of, anyways. Then you look where they had the little conflict with Korea and North Korea and South Korea and all that. Then they had this Red Dawn and a couple of those movies where it was, the Koreans were the bad guys. But it's always whoever, is the flavor of the month in the boogeyman bad guy department in the political scene is the boogeyman you're going to see in all the movies.
Yeah. You said Rocky fought the Russians. Rambo fought the Russians. They're in Afghanistan.
Slide
right.
killing with them Russians.
He fought the Russians in Afghanistan while that was happening, in the 80s.
Yeah, the Mujahideen, who
were the good guys back then.
Right, absolutely. Funny how that turned out.
Right.
Well, it really, really runs deep. I mean, it's not like the propaganda of the false flag is just the initial plot to get people bolstered. They have a whole propaganda workshop to follow that up through the movies and the media and then everything we're just touching on. I mean, it's a full deal, a psyop assault on the public.
Yeah.
And apparently it's very effective because, again, we're tracing its roots back to, you're talking the times of the early 40s.
Right.
And in that same blueprint is really still used, in today, the information age where we do have access to a lot of this stuff. And we're literally sitting here talking about it and how enlightened we are about those type of things. But they work every day still to a T.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, this is not my area of expertise, and I want to say that this was declassified some years later after the fact. I want to say Operation Northwoods, but I don't remember if that's the correct name of it. But wasn't there something during the Kennedy administration to where declassified documents leaked to where they were trying to get him to sign on to faking Cubans sinking ships and aircrafts?
Oh, they were going to shoot down an airliner over Florida.
To use that as a false pretense to go to war with Cuba.
Cuban Missile Crisis times, yeah.
During the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah, they were talking about using a drone to do it too.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Even back then. So for any of you that are questioning,
a remote-controlled airliner is what they're going to try to use.
Yeah. Now, if I want to say that's Project Northwoods or Operation Northwoods, but that's like I said, that's not my area of expertise. I could be wrong there, but and that's all declassified documents.
Right. Stuff we know.
It's
not theory.
You're right. No theory involved. That's concrete documents declassified from the government that's been released to where they were openly showing their strategies, so to speak. You're seeing their deck of cards of what they go to when they're putting a plan together.
Right.
I mean, they tried to get Kennedy to sign on to this, and thank goodness he was I can't quote because I don't know him, but I mean, it seemed like he deterred the situation.
Yeah.
When they were trying to use that as a pretense to escalate the whole Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right. Yep. And so if this is, you said it's been happening since the 40s. If you keep going back, it's been happening before that. You keep going back in time, and it goes to World War I. And in World War I, we have the same situation, like always. Two countries, in this case, multiple countries at war overseas. And an American public on the other side of the world that doesn't want to have anything to do with it. So what do? You take a giant boat of supposed innocent people on a cruise liner, and you direct it right into known enemy territories that you've been warned about. The Nazis, or the Germans, they took out ads in the New York Times and told the whole country that if you enter these waters with arms, you will be targeted by U-boats.
and even that, to cut you off a little bit there, Jay, prior to that, why in the world would that, that's almost setting itself up for, a pre-warning of don't
Right.
take this boat into these waters. And again, this
Exactly.
is in a different age where newspapers, so to have that much of a push of print media covering this is what not to do, and then you fly directly in the face of
Yeah,
that.
it's like they're preparing people's minds for the eventual event, getting
Right.
them ready for it to happen.
Sort of how we were just talking on the way over here today. There's already being planted stories in the media regarding this nuclear power plant overseas right now, where the guard was supposedly
Absolutely.
killed and his passcodes were changed. So it's like they're already putting that subliminal deep in your psyche, in your subconscious. So like me and Jay were talking on the way here, change the passcodes.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, if it's that, it's not like, oh, there's this rogue pass card floating around. Turn the card off.
Yeah.
Or change the system, for goodness sakes.
Right.
Like,
But again, the same pattern, like you said, put it in their heads. I mean, you're talking in the early 1900s. Same pattern, same blueprint for preparing the people for what's going to happen.
well, it's you have to have the ability to use discernment and critical thinking when you're reading these stories. You have to be able to look at just the lunacy of, well, turn the pass card off, or change the codes. There's no need for some kind of nuclear destruction based off of one phantom pass card that's floating around out there, or somebody with access codes.
Right.
But when you use the term critical thinking, it's funny because most anybody you would think, especially in this time of instant communication and being able to look at anything and research it for what it is, but once it's hit with that propaganda machine, I mean, it's like most people turn a blind eye to really what's right in front of them.
Right. And they're good. They're good at what they do. And they would find out in 2008, a diving crew went down to the Lusitania and found out they had more than 4 million rounds of ammunition packed away in boxes in the ship. And so there was reports that there was guns out on the decks visible to the U-boats, and that they could visually see them with their scopes. And so this is what brought everybody into the First World War. If you go before,
Well, I know I'm jumping back a little bit here, though. I know we've touched on World War II there a little bit, but if I'm not mistaken, I know we touched on the American end of things. On the opposite end, on the Nazi regime end, the whole claim of how that war started was that Hitler supposedly burned down his own Capitol building, if I'm not mistaken.
The Reichstag, yeah.
Am I
Right.
correct there? And that they blamed it on the handicapped man and claimed he was Polish to use that as
Right.
the reason to invade Poland,
yeah,
if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, no.
there.
false flag. So they had to do to not only to Americans, but they had to do the same thing to Germans because everybody turns out are pretty similar all around the world. Everyone is instinctually, it seems, resistant to war. It always has to come to the most severest of situations to gain a society's will to go fight a war.
And ironically, though, under that same mercy of whatever media they're getting, which, as we all know, comes from wholly owned
Right.
sources, so it's no real, even in those times, especially in those times where there was, you weren't getting any other information other than what was fed to you.
Right.
Right, and so that kind of transitions us pretty good into the previous war before that, because the previous war before that is one of the first wars that was able to take real advantage of the propaganda machine, and that was the Spanish-American War and the end of the 1800s. And right after the Civil War pretty much essentially had ended, they start the Spanish-American War, War of Spain over Cuba and over the Philippines. And so this is one of the first wars where American private media is able to have a real hand in convincing the American public into accepting the war that they didn't want. And so at this time you have characters like William Randolph Hearst, who owns the Hearst Empire, and you have people like Joseph Pulitzer, who the Pulitzer Prize is named after. And guys like these are using their giant media conglomerates to sell wars to the American people. And so they're approached by the government, and they are, Hearst at least, is famous for saying, "You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war." So all he needed was an artist's rendition of the event, the false flag, and then he would do the rest. He would sell it to the people with the sensationalist headlines and baseless claims that he was famous for. Yellow journalism was his invention, the basically propaganda machine that would get bigger and bigger as time went. And a lot of people don't know at this time, American business was very closely invested, or very largely invested in Cuba, tobacco and sugar mainly. But at this time, Cuba was doing, I think, importing 50% of their imports was coming from America, and 90% of their exports were going to America. So we were the by far largest business or trading partner with them. So it shouldn't be too much of a surprise that Cuba hasn't been doing well since the revolution, since they lost all of their trade. It might not completely just be because they're a communist country and that was the change. Also, there was another big change. They lost their number one trading partner. So America was heavily involved. American business was heavily involved in Cuba. And they wanted to get in there, basically, so they can run things. But the problem was that Spain was there. So they needed a war. They needed the approval. They send the USS Maine into Havana's harbor. And an explosion kills 266 people. Just out of nowhere. No one knows why it happens at the time. And the U.S. will go on to claim that it was a mine laid by the Spanish. And, of course, Spanish denies it. But then we fast forward almost 100 years later, and there's investigations, and they discover that it turns out most likely it was an internal explosion. It wasn't caused by a mine. There was just some kind of either accident or something was done on purpose. Either way, you have your war. Right? And so then America would go on to invade Cuba and invade the Philippines as well, since Spain had both and America wanted both. And billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars was gained solely from destroying one ship.
So what we're seeing here, if we take a step back and just look at the snapshot of what we've been observing all throughout history, is that the same fingerprint is on every one of these big wars. I mean,
right.
the same, maniacal dark hand
Right.
is the one working the marionette of the puppeteer.
Yep.
And persuading and pushing the public into these battles. Now, Jay, I know this is an area you've studied heavily and you're a bit of an expert on. As it stands now, to where it seems like the public is getting a little hipper to what's going on, do you see this as something that,
I think so. I think especially younger people who are more acceptable or more accepting of the idea that things like this might be happening. I think older people might be. It's just been so long where they've been in the reality that they're in that to change from that worldview is just too much of a stretch for them, probably.
To even question.
Right. Or to accept that every single American war.
And then the only flip side of that is that you think of, society as a whole now, and just how impressionable and how reliant on things like the media and just people kind of totally believing in emulating, just what is shown before them. And I mean, how powerful, the TV and internet and just society as a whole, just really monkey see, monkey do kind of culture.
Right.
I have a hard time thinking that there ever will be, any sort of sophisticated uprising of people finally realizing who the real culprits are, or the people behind the scenes.
Right.
Because in tracing through history and you're going back and you're looking at these names that are now public, or now things that we know of, the Rothschilds, the this or that. But do you really believe that, that these people are really known as far as the real puppet masters?
Do we know who is at the top of the food chain?
Absolutely.
I mean that's like the great question, and
It's a loaded question for this guy.
No, it is, and like you said, that's a whole nother topic, and more to the point, does it matter? Because say we did, say we didn't.
Right.
There's a lot of people that are out in the open. They could be,
Yeah.
The Rothschilds, the Koch brothers. You can go back to, anybody who's funding these type of endeavors.
Right.
What are we really going to do? They call it the 1% for a reason. And when you
Right.
think about that, that's a really staggering number as far as 1% of 1% of the population
6 or 7
really
billion
controls
people.
this whole thing. And that's an undeniable.
Well, just to look back, and I was trying to wrap my head around this earlier when we were talking about Vietnam, and I kind of failed to bring it up then, but I'm just thinking about it now in comparison to today. The corruption has never been more apparent than what it is today. The subliminals and the propaganda and the corrupt mainstream media is apparent now. I mean, hence the success of Donald Trump. What's different between then, where you had people in the street, your average people protesting and marching on Washington and just taking to the streets in protest of the Vietnam War, to where you see these polls, these mainstream media polls, where 86% of people are against the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and yet where's the outcry?
Right, it's you and what army? Because polls are one thing, but actual resistance. You think of anything, when I think in terms of modern times, think of the Wall Street, what was the last little uprising, where the people had banded together in New York. What was that called? For some reason, that's escaping me. But I think in terms of maybe one of the last times, maybe in the late 60s, where you had the shooting at Kane University. Once people get on a wavelength and it gets far enough to really threaten the establishment and the powers that be, you can try to suppress it in a smear campaign, if you want to call that. But at the end of the day, look at what happened. These are college students getting shot on a university. It always kind of comes back to that violence, that if things are perceived to be a big enough threat, I believe they'll be dealt with in the same manner that we deal with most outside interests that conflict with our own.
Yeah. Yep. And if we go further back, the next step is Civil War, America's bloodiest war. So we go back another 30 years. And so then you look for what the powder keg event is in this situation. And most people don't really have a event that they can point to which started this war. I don't think. I think it's kind of forgotten because it was kind of a non-event. There wasn't any deaths actually in this. What I would claim may be a false flag, where Fort Sumter in South Carolina is attacked by the South. So at the time, to set the stage, the North, Lincoln had sent Major Anderson, one of his most closely trusted majors, and he moved him to the Fort Sumter, to entice the South into a fight. At the time, both sides were seemingly trying to stay out of the war, and so the South had left Fort Sumter because it didn't want to start any kind of engagement that might turn the tide into creating a war. So they left the fort, and the North quickly seized it, and were given a timetable of when they needed to get out, or else the South would retaliate. So the North kept biding their time and not leaving the fort. And eventually, after their timeline ended, they had gotten multiple attempts to resupply the fort, trying to further entice the South into retaliating on their now captured fort. So finally, the South advances, tries to drive them out of the fort. Not a single person dies or is injured, and that was all that was needed. After that, the Lincoln responded by raising hundreds of thousands of men into an army and invading the South, causing a war that will go on to claim almost 1 million American lives, the bloodiest war in Americans' history.
So basically, I mean, you can, just from the little talking points we've touched on here between us now, I mean, it's very easy to see none of these, or, I mean, pretty much all of these wars, none of them are organic. They're not something naturally that's just brought into fruition. It's always orchestrated, controlled.
Yep.
There's factors that play, this, that, or the other. In the comment sections down below, guys, if you could help me out with that, I'll keep saying it's Operation Northwoods, and it's bothering me that I can't remember which one with that whole Cuban thing where they're trying to. Whoever can throw that in the comments would be great. It's one of those things where you're trying to remember and you know it, and then you can't remember it, so you're sitting there and just
you get stuck on it.
Right, but I mean, basically, just looking at it, I mean, we can just see where this is just apparent, and it's apparent nowadays. I mean, of course, it wasn't apparent back then. It wasn't obvious unless you delved into the research. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, it's a bit more in your face, and all we're trying to do is basically just put that out there to where people can see it and get a feel of it, to say, well, hey, it didn't all start at 9/11. It goes back further,
Yeah, put the links together. And it's like you said, these are the actual 5 times that it was actual declaration of war.
Right.
Unbeknownst that how many economic wars that we've waged and had our hands in the downfall of many other
coups and things like this. Yep. A lot of times it wasn't military. It was through economic means and private armies and stuff like that. Yep. So there's dozens and dozens of interventions and coups and things like this that are on the list. And only 5 times do they bother to follow the Constitution and gain approval of Congress for an actual declaration of war.
And now they just openly tell the public that they're not going to follow any due process. And
So and to kind of bring this into modern times, so what is, if you look at our role, and so if this is all something that's being totally controlled, is America used for their military might? I mean, is that what role we play on the global stage?
Yeah.
For
who might be using them?
More to the point, absolutely. But
the military wing of the grand group.
But we won't quite touch on that just yet. For everybody out there who knows what we're talking about, who we're talking about, but the controlling faction that controls and orchestrates the majority of a lot of this stuff. But so I mean, we're getting it out there, trying to spread it, get everybody thinking a little bit. I mean, if anything gets you interested, to go do a little bit of your own research and get into some of these topics and see where, I mean, the powers that be's fingerprints are all over all these wars. At the end of the day, everybody wants the same things: peace, love, happiness with their families, and to just live a peaceful, everybody get along kind of existence. It takes the poking and prodding and, the heat being turned up of these nefarious elites to bring these things about. I mean, so it's just the same thing I'm always preaching and talking, not to preach, but use discernment, use critical thinking, think for yourself. I mean, something's happening on the other side of the world and they're just showing you pretty pictures. It doesn't mean it's real.
Yeah. I mean, think of what you go through to be one of these people who are waging this war. Everything that you just described is kind of broken from your mental plane. You're instructed to think differently. You're turned into a warrior.
Right.
that's naturally not human instinct.
Right.
Oh.
Yeah.
Jay, thank you for stepping out from behind the shadows and
Thanks for having me.
actually getting on the microphone. Thank you for all you do for the site and the page and getting everything out there and helping us get everything together. We really appreciate it. It took a lot to get him to step out from behind the shadows, but he's finally done so, and we really, really appreciate it.
Yep.
Once again, everybody, thank you guys for the support. The feedback's been great. We really, really appreciate it. Please share these videos. Feel free to do so. Help get the word out. Thank you to everybody who's viewed, listened, liked, and subscribed. Jay, once again, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Burt,
Signing off.
I think it's about that time. Once again, everybody, thank you guys. Illusionsofreality.com. Kincade, Burt Baxter, and Jay, signing off.